The McShin Foundation is Virginia's leading peer-to-peer recovery community organization. So if you or a loved one is struggling with addiction, let us get you connected. Build your self-esteem and lead you to a solid foundation in your recovery. Check us out.
I went to Florida this week, and there's a saying I learned in recovery, back to basics, and I got thrown back to the basics of what we do here in this work. I was at one of those conferences outside the bubble, and you go to the opening night reception. It's the kind of conference where you can't find any soft drinks, it's just wine, beer, and I'm wearing the big name tag with facing addiction on it. And so I'm the popular guy with the water, and everybody wants to talk to me. Anyways, I stumble into a conversation with a guy, and he's like, "Oh, what do you do? Why are you here?" And I tell him, real quietly, he goes, "Yeah, I used to be addicted to heroin." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, I used to be addicted to heroin." And I said, "Well, that's awesome. How long you been in recovery?" He says, "Oh, I'm not in recovery. I'm not that. I moved on." And I got it. I understood it. And I understood exactly. And it wasn't that, he wasn't drinking, he had never used alcohol or other drugs again, since that time. And it wasn't, but the identity that he was a person in recovery was something he didn't want to ever admit to anybody. And it brought me back to immediately, 21 years old. I was 4 years in recovery, and I had my first job. I had a degree in media production. Had my first job, and I was dubbing tapes in Stamford, Connecticut. And we worked on A&E in the History Channel. And so there was a bunch of 20-year-olds. A couple of us worked the third shift, and we would dub that show Intervention. And I never had talked about my recovery outside of recovery support meetings, where people would share each other, with each other openly. My family knew, other people knew, but nobody else knew. And I, of course, wasn't going to tell any of I was going to go into the media industry, and what if they found out, about me? And we watched these shows, Intervention, in the early days of that show, and still these days of that show, it's 40 minutes of, the train wreck of addiction. And we know what that looks like. But these other coworkers of mine would sit there and they'd laugh hysterically at these people on television why we would dub these shows. And it was mortifying for me because that was me. And I obviously never said anything, and it took a long time. But it was that moment where I realized I knew exactly how that guy felt this week. And, I often talk about the 23 million people in recovery that we get quoted all the time. And it's just, we're missing out on a huge, huge group of people to be part of this. I love the E in Care Talks, and so that's my theme tonight, is the empowerment piece. I think there's a huge piece of work for us to do in that area still, and I'll never forget. So I left that job. I met a mentor in my life who brought me into this movement, into this recovery advocacy movement, where I started to share my own story and meet some people, meet many of the people in this room tonight. And it was, I think 2002 or 3, she says, there's a thing at the state legislature, would you come up and tell your story and with your dad and your recovery story? And I'm 5 years in recovery now, and I'm okay, fine. I go up with my dad, and the overdose epidemic is just starting, and we tell our story, and these legislators are looking at me like a freak of nature. They had never heard a recovery story like ours. And this Hartford Courant reporter comes up to me at the end of the speech and says, can I write an article about you for the Hartford Courant? And I said, sure, you just can't use my last name. And he's like, well, you just testified on closed circuit television at your state legislature, but I can't use your last name? And I said, yeah, I'm not allowed to use my last name in the newspaper. And And I was just confused. And he wrote this nice story about me, this really nice story, probably one of the nicer stories about this former drug addict who makes movies. And, but the third line of the article is Greg W. didn't want to disclose his last name. And Donna, my mentor, calls me up and she says, you know, what a nice article. If I don't understand anonymity, or I don't understand addiction, what do I read in that sentence? And I said, well, that I'm ashamed. And she said, well, is that why you're telling your story in the Hartford Current? And I said, no, I want people to know that you can get better. I want people to know that there's hope. And then we talked for an hour. And she said, you know, and she started talking. And I said, but what if I can't get a job? You know, what if I can't get in this industry? What if, you know, people, you know about my past? And what she said to me was something that she had worked with me for like 2 years at this point and worked on me. And she said something, she's like, you know, I know you're young and I know that you got a long life ahead of you, but what if the door that gets closed in your life because of your recovery that's so important is that a door you ever wanted open? And it was that statement from her that kind of cut through for me, realizing that if somebody's going to close a door in my life as a result of my recovery, it's probably a door I never wanted open in the first place. And then I met half the people in this room and realized that there's a social justice movement afoot. And you know, I was fortunate, and long story short, I you know, decide, you know, when I jump into something, I usually jump pretty far in, and decided I'm gonna go travel half the country and go, you know, deep in debt and make a film about these people. And there was one thing in the edit room that just astonished me after capturing all these stories, and it was this really powerful part about the history of this movement that I knew nothing about. And you know, I had learned a lot about the history of 12-step movements and things like that, but I knew nothing about Marty Mann and the history of recovery advocacy, and also a guy named Harold Hughes. And one of these folks had, a guy named Johnny Allen had these tapes in his attic, and he got me these VHS tapes of a guy named Harold Hughes who back in the 90s was traveling the country. He was a former senator from Iowa who was in recovery, and he was outspoken. And there was this one really scratchy VHS tape where he's talking at like a gala dinner, and he's yelling, and he's the kind of politician where when he speaks, you listen. Like if he was running last year, he would have won kind of politician. And he has this line that I'll never forget, and he says that, you know, a lot of times people blame me and tell me I'm just preaching to the choir. Well, if the choir won't sing, then who the hell will? And it really, I think, is so important for us as we start to look at this overdose epidemic, you know, the way that we are, and the newspapers and all of that. I think we often focus a lot on, but not as much on the choir who can bring these solutions forward. And so it reminded me this week around that piece around empowerment and how much work it takes, because this is deep stuff. And to get somebody who doesn't even want to identify as being a person in recovery because of the shame and the potential discrimination they might face as a result of that, to move them to the place where they're willing to stand up and come up here and talk about their recovery, that takes a lot of work and a lot of mentorship and a lot of training and a lot of education and a lot of media and a lot of care talks and a lot of different kinds of things. And I think sometimes we underestimate the work ahead of us to get to the choir to sing. And I'm so blessed. I wanted to show one clip tonight just of we're closing out Recovery Month, and I think that it's important that you know, people see the images of mass people. And I was blessed that I went on Kickstarter and I funded this specifically to capture some of this footage of people organizing around recovery. And so if we could play the first clip. There we go.
As a person in long-term recovery from an illness that has no cure, with an illness that has a solution.
I would not be standing here today, continue bettering myself as a man, as a father, owning a home. Everything that recovery has given me today, I got it. So now it's my turn to teach you that recovery works.
You have a group of people who are the humblest people I've ever met on this earth, but their spirits are strong. You can feel the spirit of that person yearning for recovery, and you can feel that same spirit when people have totally internalized and embraced this whole recovery program. It's like a light shining inside of people.
We laid the groundwork. The voices are out there. We have the science, we have the data. We have to find and open the hearts. And I think those hearts want to be open. I absolutely believe it.
If we were to be the face of Voice of Recovery and go tell our story, tell it every chance we got to everybody we came in touch with, we can reverse probably at least 50% of those people, make believers out. We're not going to get everybody to believe. That'll never happen. But by God, we can turn half of them around, because those same people did not believe that a woman should vote. And if you go further back in history, them same people didn't believe that a black person should vote or be a citizen. So as history goes by, history's on our side. History will show one day who and what we are. So I say we make history. That's what I'll say.
Right. So, you know, as Stacia Murphy says, you know, we have the science, we have the data, we have to go and find and open the hearts. And, you know, Bill White talks about the stigma, and he talks about how people don't change their perception of addiction or people who suffer from addiction until they know someone close to them who has suffered or is in recovery. And historically, we've all known people who've suffered. They're 80% of our police blotter every day. They're in our images. But we haven't encountered individuals and families who are willing to talk about their recovery. And they're just as prevalent. We have just as many people in this country in recovery as people who are suffering. We have more, actually. And so I just think it's really important for all of us. You know, Facing Addiction is proud to partner with the McShin Foundation and Faces and Voices of Recovery to put on these events. And often we talk to each other a lot. And I just think that we need to continue to preach to the choir of people in recovery, because as John says, if we can get the individuals in recovery, you know, person to person, newspaper article to newspaper article, TV interview to TV interview, water on stone, we can start to open hearts. Because the humanity's here, and you know, it's all about empowerment. And we have this group of people who don't want to share their stories. We have to figure out a way to empower them and help them to share their stories. Thanks.